You grab my book
Where's your one?
over in the corner over there.
So she talks about the multidimensional nature of whiteness, and she gives 3 points. That whiteness has a location of structural advantage, that we are in a privileged position, but that also we have a standpoint from which white people look at ourselves, at others, and at society. And third, that we have a set of cultural practices that are not named or acknowledged. I want to start there because that gives us a chance to be able to look and see, where do you see any of those 3 dynamics present around you, and how did you get to know those things, as opposed to how they're, like in the third thing, not named or acknowledged. So the 3 again are a location of structural advantage, that we are seen as an insider, that we have some kind of belonging and the benefits that go along with it. Where have you seen that? How have you felt that?
Okay.
Oh, when I was in business in Illinois, almost all the civic organizations that I belonged to were structured that way. And I knew it and I was aware of it, and that there was discrimination, but it was very prevalent.
It was for me too, in the women's
Yeah,
organization.
as I've been invited as a pastor to go to things like Kiwanis or any of the civic organizations, you're right that as I walk in that room, it is almost always completely white. Almost always.
And many of them
How about
completely
anybody else?
male. And many of them completely male.
Yes.
Yep, almost always completely male is right, because that's an insider type of group.
Yeah.
Where else? Where else are you in that privileged position, or see that location of privilege there?
When I go to my yoga studio, I go 2 or 3 times a week. There's very little diversity there. It's all a bunch of white women.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
So health clubs,
And
studio.
yeah, and part of what we have to ask is there a yoga studio for the Black people around you, and is it of the quality that you're able to access, or is it different?
Oh, that's a good point.
Anyone else? So the second point is that we get a standpoint from which we get to look at ourselves, at others, and at society, to see oneself as an individual, the privilege of being able to say, I'm outside and innocent of race. I'm just human, right? And that standpoint, that standpoint allows us to reinforce the dominant nature of things. Where have you seen that present for you? Where have you been aware of it? I'll give you one clue for myself, and this is not about race, but coming into the ministry, I had an advantage over every woman that was trying to do the very same path I was.
Yep.
And it was not fair to my female colleagues. The pathway for them was not the same.
Nor were the wages the same.
Where you seen,
In fact,
the wages are pretty
they
close
would
to the
even
same.
say-
That's closer. It's not perfect, but it's closer. But that's because of a lot of hard work
Today
on
it
the
is.
institutional level. Today it is, yeah.
Right.
A
Yeah,
few years ago, and decades ago.
Yeah, in some places.
What was that?
In some places,
Mhm.
it is. In our
Yeah,
denomination,
and that probably,
quality
yeah. Yeah.
and salaries. I think the
Yeah.
fact that
But
I went to a wonderful school that was all white, and the fact that in elementary school and junior high, we had the best stuff. Our high school was a kind of model for what a new high school ought to be.
Where were you, Harvey?
In North Long Beach, California. And the high school there was built, as a place that could be an Olympics size and stadium pool for that kind of an event. The gymnasium was brand new. The auditorium was built, and it was a place where the local civic light opera would meet on the times when they couldn't get to the major auditorium in Long Beach, which was downtown, because it was constructed or something. So all these wonderful.
How many have noticed that when a new high school is built in a city, it is typically not built downtown, in the poorer areas, in the ethnic areas, right?
Right.
The new high schools are built, right?
That
rule.
was true when I went to high school. And that was a very long time ago.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, it's got to be at least 15, 20 years, right, Virginia?
Right.
Well, I do remember where we were living, they built a wonderful technical high school downtown in the city, and it became such a good model that they moved it back out into the suburbs. Would you believe that? It made no sense at all. They took a perfectly wonderful model that, there was transportation, kids could get on the bus to go downtown to the school and so forth. And the school was doing so well that they moved it out into the suburbs where the white people were. I mean, it was just appalling.
Yeah.
It wasn't that long
So
ago.
have you look at all? Oh, go ahead.
It's not just
So I have you
they
thinking
don't
about.
make them in the
Go.
ethnic areas. Cities change and people move out of areas, and some areas get a little worse before they get better again. It's what is deemed the poor or the under the lower economic area that get neglected. You see that with Catalina High School. When they built that in 1922, that was the premier high school in the state, and it was never maintained as people started moving out of that area into more affluent areas.
Yeah.
Right. I have us look at all those questions because one of the things she deals with in the middle of chapter 2 is white supremacy. And she very clearly says none of us wants to identify as being white supremacists, because our definition of what that means is all in the negative. But she tries very hard to say, but part of what white supremacy is whatever advantages we have. It's helpful for us to take it out of the negative and move it into what it is that we're doing, and how do we not have that umbrage that she talks about around white supremacy, so that we immediately close our ears, close our hearts, and don't think about it any longer. Because naming white supremacy, she says, changes the conversation, because it makes the whole system visible and it shifts the focus of change onto us. And isn't it much simpler if it's somebody else that has to change? If you women would just act more like me, it would be simpler for you to fit into society, right? But that's somebody else changing instead of me.
Yeah.
Why do we go so quickly to that, though? Much less threatening, right? Much less intimidating to point out how you have to fit. Go ahead.
I was going to say the organization I belonged to at one time, the Junior League, actually had a rule in it. It didn't come out, it was one of those coded kind of rules. No people of color. And the other one was that the only way to get in was to go through a committee. And if your husband didn't have a good position in the town, recognizable, you weren't invited either. And it made me so angry. I went before the entire board of 30 people and they said, if you didn't like it, why did you accept membership? And I thought, oh, lady, you just raised a red flag. So one of the most influential people in the community was a Black woman, and she was an amazing woman. And also Jewish. They didn't like Jews either. So I got on a committee that was a committee that screened people and made it very clear that we were not going to judge on the committee people by the color of their skin or where they lived in the community or what their spouse did. And I got up and put the meetings on suspension because I was chairman until we could come back and agree that we were not going to use any of those as guidelines for deciding who came into an organization that did good work in the community. Basically, one of those, I'm a good person, how can I be a racist? So anyway, you know, you can't, but you face danger. I mean, I had all kinds of people say ugly things about me because we invited women who were Jewish and who were of color. And it was my fault. And a friend of mine's mother, who was one of the founders, quit.
Wow.
Yeah.
Harvey said something.
And I think that one statement you made is one. Go ahead.
Stop.
I think one of the statements you made is one of the basic things that keeps us at odds with moving forward. And that is, if I'm a good person, I can't be.
Mm-hmm.
And so we try to prove our goodness rather than being honest about how we still benefit from. And so we never get in the real conversation that should be had.
Well, I think again, that
Because
goes back to her earlier point that, you know, too often we talk about racism and say, well, I'm not a racist person. You know, I might even have a friend or two who's Black. You know, so I'm not a racist. But we forget the great amount of advantages that we as white people have just from being white and living in this place.
Yeah.
Yeah. But part of the reason why the conversation has to be that racism lies in the corporate rather than in the individual is to help with that. If it's not you that are racist, but the system that allows you to benefit from racism, then it's a whole different thing, right? Because it's not saying you're bad, but it is saying, are you aware enough to see what it is where you're perpetuating that which is bad? So it takes away from the blame, but puts an onus back onto us as individuals. Leticia.
I have an example from when I was younger. Harvey, you brought up education. I'm pretty well educated too. But the institutional part of it, if I'm dealing with a good old boys network, which is what they call Tucson Forever,
Mm-hmm.
this negates any education. They don't even assume. They assume that I was it was given to me through affirmative action, or I didn't really earn it, right? And it's underlined. So much so, and I didn't want to believe it when I was younger, because I grew up in a Tucson where all the minorities came together. They all went to school together at Tucson High. They loved each other. They worked together to run this town. And in 1985, when the loan documents started requiring that we fill out what ethnic group we were at, I started to see a change. And about that time, so I was 20, it was a couple years later, late 20s. I was a commercial escrow officer, and in the 80s, we made a lot of money. And it wasn't an easy field because you had to know law, you had to know real estate, it was and accounting. It was pretty complicated. And I had somebody that was a district legislator for the state, right? And she came up to me and said, Letitia, I feel sorry for you. Why? And she said, you'll never succeed in life.
Wow.
And I went, why? Because I got pregnant at 17. Got married 3 months later. Bought my first home before I turned 19 years old. She didn't know any of that. But the assumption, I said, what makes you say I'll never succeed? And I've talked about objectification of people. Her answer was, because you're a Latina, teenage, unwed mother. You statistics say that you'll never succeed. So this woman only saw me as a statistic because of the color of my skin.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things. We often talk about affirmative action, but we don't realize how many great advantages those of us who were white had. We didn't have somebody point us and say you're brown or you're black or something else, so that means obviously you're inferior. But more than that, it's the places where we could live and where we could go. I was absolutely shocked when my African-American son-in-law was stopped because he was driving a nice car, and the policeman wanted to know how he could come up with that nice car. Unfortunately, he had just married my daughter, and so the car was in her name. So he went to jail for a little while until they could get that all sorted out. Do you think that would happen to you or me in 1990?
No.
You know?
Yeah.
Happened to me in 1999.
Presumption of privilege.
Yep.
Joni saw a story this morning about a lady who was driving along, saw a young black man pulled over, and almost immediately 4 other cop cars came.
Whoa.
Okay, it was first like a registration thing, but all of a sudden, an inspection that had run out. But all of a sudden, there's that many police officers around this man. So she stayed there in order to say, are all of you truly needed here? Is this what this situation warrants? But I've been stopped quite a bit because I like to go fast too much. And I've never had more than one cop car pull up behind me.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
And all of that gives us as she said in here, that we all have a limited view because our privilege, our advantages, our skin color helps us to not have to face some of the things that other people have to face. What is your limited view that you get to live in that somebody else doesn't have to face?
There was a dilemma for me in some cases where if I didn't join those things, I paid a price. And so if I wanted to succeed, if I wanted to get ahead, I had to do it whether I liked it or not. And that was what Mary was talking about. And so I had to ignore what my emotional feelings were or how I felt uncomfortable. And that was a reality of how it was. I needed to eat. I wanted to get ahead. I wanted to be in the right culture that moved with the community, and I wanted to do business.
Yeah. And so you buy into a system that allows you to do that better or more. That's easy.
Exactly. That's what I was talking about. That's what I was talking about last week. It's a damn system that I'm not powerful enough to make a change, even though I recognize, and I did in some cases, but maybe not in a satisfactory kind of way, or I was either that or spasmodic at it.
Well, we're social social animals, so we want to get in our group. And so that's where our group is. We're right there with
Yeah.
them. I mean, that's a very powerful driving force.
And the insidious part.
Sorry. I just wanted to let Mike know that minorities had to work within that system too. And what we're seeing now is the fact that we worked within the system with this carrot that said, you do like we do and you'll have all the advantages, but the cards are stacked against us. So now we're seeing the rage from it.
Yeah.
Because it's been held in.
And the insidious part about it for us is that the system itself almost begs us not to see, because it's simpler not to see. Just live with it, Hispanic folks, and you'll maybe have a place there. Don't notice it, don't complain about it. White folks, don't notice that these people have a harder path than you, right? And yet it is that noticing that I think is essential. Us being aware. Go ahead, Laura.
So like what Letitia just said, though, is I think I bought into the same thing that she bought into, that if you do the same as what we're doing, you'll get to be where we are. And I stupidly thought that was the way it was. So if anybody wasn't where I was, they just hadn't worked hard enough. So I did the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is about the only thing Laura has.
There's always a meritocracy system. Did you merit this or that? And there is, even among the white people, if you were handicapped in some way, you couldn't measure up. And if you had a lesser of an education, I had friends who had no college education, for instance, but were trying to get up and move up the level, and that was a handicap for them. So there are many ways in which we're handicapped or held back in the crowded white supremacy crowd, but it's a little unnerving to me. And I know we're focusing on blacks right now, but it's true that with the Latino community or with the Asian or the other communities.
That's right. And because that, Mike, is something that's based primarily on, okay, so I might have had an opportunity to have or not have an education. And so maybe it's fair if someone says, so-and-so has a bachelor's degree and you don't, that might give them a step up. But when it comes down to, oh, so-and-so is white and you're Asian, so-and-so has a skin color that makes them more acceptable, that's not something that has a merit of its own, but just one we're placing on. That's the difference. Right. And who is it that we are essentially disqualifying or putting lower on the qualification scale because of? The white racial frame she talks about in the end of chapter 2. And wasn't chapter 2 just a really dense chapter? Lots of information. So thank you for letting us take some time to be able to deal with that. But that white racial frame where she says we have that views both whites as superior in some way or another, as that social institutions are controlled by whites as a general rule, and that negative stereotypes are generally on those of color. All of those make it easier for us to sit here and not even see that which is holding someone else back. So how are you fighting that? Go ahead.
How are you fighting it? I don't know. Is there some kind of sense of shame or do, I guess I find myself doing this, that when I'm around people of color that I don't know, that I tend to be a little more polite than usual, as if I need to do that. So it's already my bias that just because I'm white, I may insult them with my presence, or I'm being intrusive. You know, I don't know how to respond to some of that.
But part of that is where you're getting into the third chapter. Remember, they talked about that the set of college students going out there, and they said that one of the things that happens is that we set up the set of laws that says this is what we do. Not laws so much as norms. This is what we act polite, but then on the other side we don't. Right? When we're by ourselves, we act differently. Go ahead, Leticia.
Jim talked about the attitude if you're just a little bit more like us, right? What I hear from the Latino people that I work with is that when they get into a conversation with Anglos that are by honestly trying to help them, right? They speak like that, and it's interpreted on the other side as I don't know what to do when they're trying to tell me what my experience is, and they're trying to speak for me. So they're overly polite too. So it's about not so much speaking, but listening for both sides. And that's what I battle when I'm trying to reach out and do empowerment stuff for minorities.
Is that kind of a paternalism? You know, yeah, I know it and I got it, so I want you to help you.
Yeah, it's well intentioned, but it doesn't come out right. We had somebody, we were talking about the social economic stuff, and you know, people move out of an area, it's declared life, and it's the poor and the minorities that get the short end of the stick when gentrification comes in, right? And we were having a discussion, it wasn't when this started, but somebody said, well, why don't we just get them to move up? But they don't have the economic advantage to do that.
Yep, right.
Sure. So let me speak to that, because there's some different dynamics of what we try to do as Anglos that aren't necessarily the most helpful. All right. You know that much of my background was teaching bilingual education and dealing with English and Spanish kids in the same classroom and trying to help them both to succeed. Very often these kids might have come with their parents across the border, but for sure their parents had crossed probably illegally, right? And so the primary language of the parents and of many of my children was Spanish. And so obviously I have a priority on helping them to learn English, but I realized right away that trying to help them learn English too quickly to make my English instruction easier was actually detrimental to them. Have I shown you? No, I'll just show it to you.
Immersion.
Let me turn my video back on. If there's a group of kids that start at 0 language-wise, and I'm trying to figure out how to help them move from into where they are succeeding well in my classroom. There's a couple of different typical processes we use. Bilingual education, I teach them in Spanish until they transition themselves into English, or I teach them in English, known as ESL, so that they transition into English quicker. Okay, so let me show you on this graph, if they start at 0, which no kid does, but if they start at 0 and I teach them ESL, the graph looks something like this. Let me see if I can get this up here so that you can see what it looks like. Okay, it goes something like that. Can you see that? A relatively steep climb and then a leveling off.
Yes.
If I teach them bilingually, where I let them stay in their strength and then grow, it looks more like this. See if I can show you the difference.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Oh my God.
So here's the thing. Do you see where I wrote 50%? If I teach them ESL, they succeed quicker, but they level off at 10 points below average. Whereas if I help them learn more in their own language, they end up averaging 10 points over the average. And so if I do what's easiest for me, if I do what's easiest for me, I can sign them to lesser success.
Wow.
Whereas if I take
Yeah, in LA Unified, they found just the opposite. My wife taught in Watts for 17 years, and we think that is a black area. And it was when she went there. When she went there, it was 80% black and 20% Hispanic, and nothing else. And when she left, it was 80% Hispanic and 20% black. And what they found was just the opposite. If they didn't call it ESL, they just called it immersion. And so you were dealing with kids and trying to get them to learn the language quickly. And they found just the opposite, that the kids that learned through immersion ended up at a higher level than the kids who learned bilingually. So that's interesting. And that was,
Jim, isn't immersion only effective to a certain age?
Well, there's different studies about how to do all of this instruction. It's not that immersion type of instruction is wrong. It's okay. So I'll give an example of one of my hardest students ever to teach. His name was Isaac, not Isaac, because his parents made a decision before I knew them that they were going to immerse him completely in English, but they had nothing of English to give him. So he was extremely language poor, right? And so he had nothing to draw from as I was trying to teach him in any language. He didn't have Spanish, he didn't have English, because they spoke almost nothing in their home because they didn't know enough English to be able to speak well. When we try to force someone into a mode that is not their own, we take away resources from them. The reason why the studies that I've seen that show that bilingualism works better is because it allows them to keep the strengths of what they had, plus add the new strengths of the new language. And so it gives them two ways to be able to draw from. I find that even in myself. From the time that I learned Spanish, I began understanding the English language better. Why? Because I was able to draw from two different founts to be able to understand it.
that's the point of having.
Okay?
Good point.
And the more resources we can draw from, the easier it is for us to move forward. And so if we're taking someone and saying, here's all you get, especially if we're taking away something that is more native to them, if we're taking away their parents' ability to be there and present as a primary teacher because we are teaching in a way that the parents don't understand, we hurt. If we're not instructing those parents and helping them to be strong in the educational process, but we divorce the kids from the teaching, the kids from the parents from the teaching, then we hurt those children. Does that make sense? And how much are we being, as Harvey said, paternalistic in all of this, saying I have the right answer, but at the expense of what?
Yeah.
We also do that culturally, right? Be more like me.
We do.
Sure.
And when we tell the culture, be more like me, as a parent, especially I'm more Spanish than I am Latino, but I was raised here. So culturally, I have the Latino culture just from several generations, a number of generations being from Mexico in this area. But when we try and take a culture and say, be more American, because there really is no American culture. We're a mishmash. We all grew up hearing that we're a melting pot, right? But it's hard to then culturally teach my children the strengths of their culture. and there are a lot of strengths to being Latino. They've got an unbelievable work ethic, mathematically skilled as a culture, all those kinds of things. But
Right.
the immigrants will say, okay, we'll be more American. And as a whole society, white, black, Hispanic, and I'm sure it's the same in the Black community too, we're losing strength by not allowing people to grow in their own cultural strength.
Yeah, sometimes when we're together, I'll share some of my experiences with you about that. There's some great stories about that.
Yeah. Chapter 3 is about
Well,
what you're talking about, Leticia, but it says 3 different ways that we essentially do that, right? And the one you're talking about specifically is cultural racism, where we assume that one culture has priority over another, that there's something about this culture that ought to be learned. We ought to learn about George Washington, but maybe not learn as much about Santa Ana in any kind of a positive way, right? We teach white geography, but not necessarily black geography, right? And all of that cultural
Native
racism.
American.
Because the white Northern European kind of culture is the best, and that is the white man's burden to impose that upon the rest of the world. I mean, that's the, you know.
Yeah. Way too often, isn't it? Yep.
Well,
And we do that.
assimilation.
Keep going.
I'm sorry. It was in the indigenous people, assimilation. Well, I mean, you want to talk about destroying a people. They take away, you're not allowed to speak your own language, and you're punished if you do. You're cut off. You're not allowed to practice your own religion. It's deemed savage and worthless. What happened to the indigenous people is probably one of the most heinous crimes that the white culture imposed upon. It was the whole idea that we could make you more white if you would just stop doing what it is you're currently doing and do what I tell you is the right thing to do.
Yeah.
But do you realize that that happened after the Native Americans actually sent representatives to be senators and congressmen for their people?
Oh, yeah.
And that happened because it's like, oh, they're getting this. We can't let them do that. So we're going to offer them this carrot over here. It's all about carrots for control.
Well, I think that's one of the missing things in our history, that it really is a matter of one class of people controlling the rest.
Right.
Yeah. And it's based on economics.
And
anything else?
Very often. But I'm not certain it's just based on economics, Leticia. That's a dynamic, but I think it's also based on power. Right? There's lots of things where we say, we don't even recognize it, but we say this is where we assert it on each other. A couple of years ago, at our state capitol, a man was walking past in the midst of some of the stuff that was going on, and some of the protesters, white protesters, looked at him and said, "Go back to your own country." Now, this man was the state representative from my old area where I taught school and was a pastor, right? And was an amazing man, right? But the color of his skin said, you've got to be something lesser than the long-time generational family that you are. Right? So we essentially robbed him, that protester robbed him of his cultural heritage, even though it was deep and rich.
What was the name of the first Hispanic governor of Arizona back in the 19...
Raul Castro.
Yeah.
Raul Castro.
One time we had a retreat up in Mingus Mountain, and one of the clergy who was going to attend that retreat was late. All of the rest had gotten up there. And he said, well, I had to stop and help this fellow change a tire. And it was Raul Castro. And he said, you know, thanks for coming along and stopping, because all these other people passed me. You know, they saw a brown man standing beside his car, looking down at a flat tire, and said, forget it.
Yeah.
But you know, Raul,
So in some ways,
he didn't get upset about that.
No,
And that was in the early 70s.
Yeah, right. It was in the early 70s, yeah.
so if that cultural racism is because we see race in some ways too much and we push it down and try to stop it, the first of the three dynamics that they talked about was the opposite, to act as if race is not there at all, what they called colorblind racism. And remember the story that she told about her and her co-presenter, an African-American man who was there, and the one person said, I don't see race, I don't see you as black. And his reply was, then how can you talk about racism? How can you see racism?
Mm-hmm.
If we are not there in conversation with the people who are underseen or undervalued in this, how can we know? If I don't hear that story of that other person, how can I even begin the process of whatever reconciliation needs to happen?
Yeah.
But think about the places where somebody overlooked you in whatever way it happened to be, right? It could be as simple as, you must be like your older brother, that the high school teacher said, right? When the older brother had whole different skills than what, right? Do we see the person in front of us? I
The
had
real
going
explanation
both directions.
I
Go
got
ahead.
from that about her pulling away from the black man's presence. When she extended that explanation, really helped me understand this pretense that she didn't notice his race, assumed that he was just like her, when in fact he isn't. Don't ignore the fact that he's black, that he is different. And in so doing, what D'Angelo writes, she did not notice his race, assumed that he was just like her, and in so doing, she projected her reality onto him. For example, I
That's
feel
right.
welcome at work, so you must feel welcome too. Because I'm comfortable, you must
That's
be
right.
comfortable.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
That's what men do to women.
And do we take?
too.
Yes.
It is
exactly.
exactly what
Yes,
we as
Virginia.
a gender do. You're right.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
The difficulty of that is we do it sometimes because it's the simpler way rather than the best way.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, but
And
there's
we
so
have
much,
to
way.
there's
force
so much
ourselves.
denial in that. It's not just that it's simpler.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep. Yep. And somehow we have to get past all of that. But that takes intentionality and it takes effort. Right? It's much simpler if I'm just smarter than every woman in my life. If I'm just better than every black man in my life. If I'm just, right? And it's just not true. So what do? How do we, in this moment, try to take a better route than that? All these things we've been talking about that we've all been enculturated into doing and that give us advantages. How do we work better than that?
I do think that one of the first steps is listening, doing a whole lot more listening.
Yeah.
than talking.
Mhm.
Yeah. That's why I love the story about that I just told you about, that she said about her co-presenter. Do you see my blackness and try to hide from it, or do you hear me? Do you see me so that you hear better? And that takes some time and some effort and some intentionality.
Well, it's also about how the agenda gets set.
Oof, agendas.
I mean, who sets what we're going to talk about
Yeah.
and where
Yeah.
and where?
Yeah, I'm in a current argument with some folks that is basically around exactly what we're talking about. Where does racism lie, and is it in the corporate or individual? And what they want to see, because it's much simpler, is BLM, Black Lives Matter, is just a wrong organization, because look at this, A, B, C, D. Is it just that? My thing is it just that, or is there something more that's in the question? Well, they want to say, no, it's just that they're evil. They're just bad. They're a terrorist organization. Well, that's a simple narrative, but it's not a true, complete narrative. No matter how much bad you can define there, it doesn't define the whole of the struggle, but it's putting blinders on.
Upsetting the system.
That reminds me a lot of Martin Luther King's response to the 8 or so pastors in Birmingham that he replied to in his Birmingham letter. You know, that you're going too fast, too much, you know, and you know, that's an excuse that people who are racist have used forever.
Mhm.
Yeah. If you haven't read that Birmingham letter recently, go back and reread it, because it is powerful.
Just read it.
Go ahead, Lucy.
Somebody said something about telling folks to go back where they came from.
Oh, yeah.
I moved back to Tucson in 2017, and there's a gala that they do to support some Border Patrol agents' family that got killed a few years ago. And there was going to be an Antifa protest at it. So I do a little photojournalism. I was doing some at that time. So I went to go and check it out. You know, we don't really see anything like that here for a while. And I roll up, and I had the leader of the Antifa movement come up to me with a bullhorn up to my car window, up to my car as I was trying to figure out where to park with the attendant, and scream in my ear, get ready to go back, get ready to get arrested, get ready to be body searched, and they're going to send you back to where you came from. And I looked at her and said, I just got back. This is where I come from. So we got to be really Jim always talks about intentionality. We really have to be careful on our intentionality and know our audience. And not 15 minutes later, I had a counter protester do the same thing to me.
Yeah.
She takes a bullhorn behind my head and tells me to go back.
Yeah.
Letitia, you must wear a sign on your back that says "kick me."
I'm a little too outspoken, so they come after me.
Yeah.
But,
And part of it is who she is, but part of it is also that we feel very comfortable in saying some of those things to people of certain skin tones or of different nationality that we can tell are not quite like the rest of us, or that in whatever way we can separate out. We've given ourselves, and by ourselves I mean the dominant culture, we've given ourselves permission to see certain people differently.
Racial
but
bias.
I do want to support that. That's a human nature thing. You know, the Mexican jokes, the ethnic jokes that white people tell, Latinos tell it, but you guys are the joke. The white guys
That's
are
right.
the joke, right? it's human nature. And I think we need to start looking more at the commonalities and not just listen, but engage and find out. Because when you start expanding your cultural vista, we share more in common than we have not.
Yeah. But see,
And I
but see
saw
that,
Evelyn with her hand up.
Yeah, that means you have to take a more difficult path than the easiest. Evelyn.
Mike's not on.
You're still muted.
It didn't click right, sorry.
There you go.
You know, I spent several years in Venice, California in the late 60s into early 70s. At that time, Venice, California was not what you see on TV today. It was very run down.
Right.
As a white child in school, I was a minority. The predominant was the blacks in that area, followed by Hispanics, and then Asians and whites picked up the rest. So from an early age, I had a lot of interaction with minorities, especially people of color. We all had the same opportunity there. I do know that I'm actually still in touch with my elementary teacher. She's 80 some years old now, and several of us of the black children have done quite well. They were able to get opportunity, but all that aside, and then moving to Southern California, I was in aerospace industry. I had to go into to pick up supplies and stuff for the business, go into areas predominantly people of color. And Pacoima was a especially rough town, still is. I was able to go in there during the day, but and here it becomes cultural, because we all talk about the whites discriminating against the blacks, but even there, they allowed you to do business, but basically it was told, don't be here when the sun goes down. So all the cultures seem to have some of this protection type thing of their own culture. So we need to break down these barriers somehow to where the cultures can work together and not negate each other.
That's right. The difficulty is always this, like my friends that I was telling you about that I'm in the argument with, it's much simpler if it's only Black America, Black Lives Matter that are the negative spaces, right? That if only those neighborhoods are the bad spaces. I look at people like Ahmaud Arbery, who went into a white neighborhood and was killed because of it, right? Sometimes our white neighborhoods are dangerous for people of color, and we don't want to acknowledge that. It's much simpler if it's only their neighborhoods that are dangerous. But you're right, that what it takes is us all opening our eyes to more than just the simple stories.
We've got to change the way things work.
So how, so how are you beginning to do that is the real question. What are the things that you're doing to very intentionally be in a larger conversation than what's simplest? How are you making yourself stretch beyond yourself? Go ahead, Laura.
I don't know how to answer that, but I am impressed by the fact that we have a church that has brought itself together to stand with those folks who are being pushed to the edges. And most predominantly, I think it's the LGBTQ community. It seems to me as if we could do something about this, as if we could use our effort. We have an enormous amount of talent and strength at our church, and I would like to see us begin to work on this. It's got to be more than just a bunch of people saying, well, yeah, we love all Black people. Anybody can come to our church who's Black. We all know that from the experience with the LGBTQ community. We've got to begin to work on this.
That's right. Laura.
I'm going to save my comments / story for next week. Go ahead, Evelyn.
Yeah, with being involved, like say, invite, welcoming LGBTQ or Black people to your place. Why not go to one of their churches of worship, interact with them in their space rather than have them come to you and try and get a better understanding of them.
Interesting.
Yeah. I've often held that the hardest thing about St. Francis is not all the people and how people want to be. It's that we sit on these castle walls on the edge of Tucson that make it really easy for us to hide in a protected community rather than intentionally move beyond that community and into some of those areas where we could be an amazing driving force. And I think every time I see something like Reading Scene, that was an attempt to step beyond the easy space into a better space. And I think we have to look right now, where are some of those spaces today?
Yeah.
There was a time when my father and I owned a church building, and we rented it to a Black congregation. And they would have celebrations, and we would be the only white people in the church visiting. And we were invading that culture. And they were very nice to us, very polite to us, but they really weren't happy with that fact that we didn't belong there. And we knew that. But it was all about feeling that feeling of being on the other side. And I employed people who were different racial denominations or ethnic denominations than I was. And I had a Spanish guy go out and stand in the rain one day and yell at me from the parking lot, "See, I really don't know how to come in out of the rain." So we had ways in which we communicated and learned how to get along with each other. "Now you can call me a wetback," he said. Yeah, Mary reminded me.
Oh, that's funny. That's funny.
The good news is
Art.
we don't have to solve this all this week. We have 3 or 4 more weeks of this class to solve it. But next week we will do chapters 4 and 5. Okay. Sorry to cut off the discussion, but just know that we have plenty of time to be able to discuss more. All right, Art, you had something?
I was just going to say, I think a lot of you know I drive for ICS, and that's a wonderful way to get to meet our community. Today, actually, I just got through taking an African-American lady shopping, and a lot of Hispanics, and so I have a chance to visit and talk with them. And it's quite rewarding, the conversations we have sometimes. So that's one thing. And they need some drivers from St. Francis area. So keep that in mind.
You're shameless.
So let's get you into a point where you can make that invitation to the whole of the church.
Yeah.
Right. All right. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming
Jim.
today. We will see you in a week.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.